Welcome to the build video for the Twisted Hobbies Crack Yak Mini. I'm going to begin the build by getting all of the foam pieces out of the box, inspected, and ready to start gluing. We're going to use welder's adhesive on this build, and I'm going to show you a process that allows you to use welder's adhesive yet still build the airplane in a relatively short period of time. We're going to start by putting glue on all of the pieces that we're going to assemble and setting them aside to dry. So here I'm putting glue on the canopy piece itself and then the part of the fuselage where the canopy goes. I'm smoothing it out with the glue tip and will wipe up any excess that falls on the outside of the glue joint area. We'll also apply welders to the wing centers and the part of the fuselage where the wings attach as well. And we will also apply welders to the elevator where it attaches to the fuselage and the back of the fuselage horizontal piece. Notice that after you've put these on the bench to dry, you're going to want to flip them over every once in a while, make sure that nothing's actually glued down to the bench. While the welder's glue is tacking up, we're going to pull out the wing spars out of the carbon fiber package. I cut this piece of tape here to make it easier to get the carbon fiber out. And we want the two flat pieces. These pieces make up the spars for the wing. So there's several methods for doing the wing spar. The first method here is to use packing tape. I'm using the sticky side up. I'm just putting it on the bench as a way to hold the two spar pieces edge to edge so I can glue them together. Once you've got a good edge-to-edge alignment, use some thin CA to glue the spars together. The big picture here is these two spars sit edge-to-edge on top of each other inside of the wing as your wing spar. Another option would be to put the spar into the top of the wing, use welders in a wet application, flip the airplane over and put the other spar into the bottom of the wing, and let them glue together inside of the wing itself. The only real downside to doing it that way is there's a potential for you to overlap the spars, and if they are overlapped, it's possible to get a little bit of a warp inside of the wing. Either one is actually pretty easy to do, so it's up to you which one you choose to do. I like this method because you get a nice flat spar going in, and it's a lot easier to put the wing spar in and get a straight wing. So now that the welder's been tacking up for a while we did the wing spar, I'm going to go ahead and start the assembly of the fuselage. When you're doing a dry assembly of welder's adhesive, it's an instant bond the minute it touches, so you want to be careful as you're putting the pieces on to make sure that they're lined up and going on straight and that you don't touch it accidentally in some place that you don't want it to. So here with the canopy, I'm starting at the back. I'm lining up the back part of the canopy to the fuselage, and I'm going to kind of roll the canopy into position until I get about halfway, and then I'll line up the front and move it into position. So the big picture is it is an instant bond, but because we've only let it dry here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, the welders is still pretty soft, so even if you get it off a little bit, you can still move it around, but for the most part, it's an instant, quick bond. Okay, so now using that same technique, we're going to install the wing halves onto the horizontal piece of the fuselage. There are tabs on the wing that line up with tabs in the fuselage that make it impossible for you to put the wings on backwards or upside down. So we're going to go ahead and use that same roll into position method that we did on the canopy. And because this welders is tacked up while we did that wing spar, it's going to be a quick process to go ahead and assemble the rest of the horizontal parts of the plane. This is a good time to go ahead and remove the little tabs inside of these slots. These slots are where the side force generators attach. Because of the way it's lasered, there's some little tabs that are left in there. You just need to clean them out. The next thing we're going to do is flip all of the control surfaces over onto the hinge line and weight them and let them wait for maybe 30 minutes while you go do something else. This is an important thing to free up the hinge line, and it makes your servos move a lot smoother and cleaner later on. Okay, on this airplane we have to cut the wing spar. There are two little lasered out holes that mark where the wing spar ends go. I couldn't find my long straight edge here, so I'm using a long piece of plywood, but you get the idea. We need to cut with a very sharp knife and a very perpendicular cut to the wing, straight down the line between those two lasered holes, and that's where we're going to put our spar assembly. And like we talked about before, you can either use the one-piece spar like we made here in this video, or you can put half of the spar in the top side, flip it over, put half the spar in the bottom side, use welders and let it dry up. So once you've got a nice clean cut, we're going to use our spar assembly. Now keep in mind this is just tack glued in with CA, so you don't want to push down on it too hard because it will break that glue joint. But just gently slide it into position, get it into the airplane, and make sure everything sits flush. Once you're happy with the way the spar lines up, you need to put down something to protect your bench against the glue. You can use painter tarps like we've used before in other build videos, but this time I'm just going to use that same packing tape I used before. We're just going to use the shiny side up this time, and I'm going to make sure that the spar is lined up over that packing tape as we do our gluing. So this is a wet application of welders for the spar, so I'm not going to be too ginger about how much I'm using here because we're probably going to wipe up most of what we put in, but I want to make sure we get a good bit of glue between the spar joints in the front half of the wing and the spar joint in the back half of the wing, and we'll flip it over and we'll do the same thing. As we go along here, we want to clean up the excess welders with paper towels, and one trick that I would tell you is that don't wait too long to clean up the excess, because as it starts to get sticky, it'll pull up the paint as you wipe it off. So as soon as I get done going through this, I'm going to squeeze it together, get the glue to gush up out of the joint, and then wipe it up real quickly. And that'll probably be the last time I wipe it up, because even after a few seconds of drying in the air, it'll start to cure, and then that will pull up the paint if we try to do it again. So I'm going to flip it over, make sure that on the bottom side of the wing we've got the same scenario, that everything looks good, there's not too much gushing up, and that we've got a good glue joint. If we have to add glue here, we'll go ahead and do it. Because we got a lot of glue on the bench in the process of putting that spar in, I'm just going to go ahead and put down a clean piece of tape here. This is going to be the final piece of tape that it actually dries on. Remember, the glue is still wet. It's only been in here a couple minutes. I'm going to use the weights that I've got to kind of hold the airplane in position and make sure that the spar joint is straight and flat while it dries. One thing you can do here is look at the paint lines on the wing and in the fuselage to make sure that they're straight, because it is possible to kind of put a bend or a twist into the airplane even though it'll be sitting flat on the bench. This is the one joint of the airplane where I will let it dry for some period of time. It's the most critical piece, and it's a wet application, so you want to make sure that everything is completely dry before you get too far. After it's dried for about an hour, I'll come back and put the top vertical part of the fuselage in place, and we'll let it dry again after that for maybe another hour. Because the top part of the fuselage here is tabbed into the lower part of the fuselage, this is going to be another wet application of welders. But because it's tabbed together, it'll hold itself in place, and it's a lot easier wet application than the wing spar was. So what I'm doing is getting glue on all of the tabs and all the flat parts of the fuselage. The one place where you don't want glue is right where the servos attach, because you're going to need to put glue in there later to hold the servos in. Go ahead and put glue on the lower part of the fuselage as well, and again, make sure right around the servos to leave a little bit dry area so you can glue the servos in later. The most important thing with all of the fuselage pieces is to make sure the motor mount area lines up perfectly. So once you've kind of got all the tabs in place here, this thing is still able to slide back and forth. So you want to make sure that not only is it perpendicular to the wing, but the forward part where the motor mount is flush against the lower piece of the fuselage. In this case here, I let it dry overnight. It was a natural stopping point in the build for me, so I let it do that. Normally 2 hours would be about as long as you'd want to let that dry. It doesn't stick to that tape very good at all, so it should come right off of the bench. You want to make sure that your fuselage pieces are horizontal. With EPP, it's never too late to straighten anything out because this stuff is flexible enough to bend. But you just want to do a general inspection, make sure everything is flat and good to go. Next step is going to be to install the aileron servo. We're going to be using a 4-gram servo in this position. Output gear needs to go forward. One way to always check with these airplanes which way the output gear needs to go is to check the fuselage piece that they're going to go into. In this one you can clearly see that forward is the output direction. You want to make sure you know where the leads are going to come out for all your servos before you glue them in. I like my servo leads to come out on the left side and all of them to come out on the bottom. So I'm going to make sure they route in that direction. We're going to glue in a servo. You want to use as little glue as necessary to glue in a servo. You want to put a little tiny drop in the tabbed area where the tabs of the servos are going to rest, and a little drop on the side and on the bottom to kind of hold the servo in place so it won't twist. So the next step is going to be to build the aileron servo arm. We're going to cut out the aileron servo arm from the laser cut plywood board. We're going to use the double-sided servo arm that comes in the servo hardware kit and the 2 screws for mounting the servo that also come in the servo hardware kit. The plywood piece goes on over the output shaft on the bottom of the servo arm. Then we're going to use a small drill to pre-drill the hole for the servo mounting screws that came out of the hardware bag. You want to make sure that the drill that you use to pre-drill the servo arm is big enough so that you don't have to put a lot of pressure on the screw to screw it in. It's a semi-delicate piece, especially with the Mini when we're talking about very small parts. You want to make sure you can screw that screw in without having to really torque on it. After you put in both screws, take a little drop of thin CA around the head of the screws and around the output shaft to make sure that it's firmly glued onto the servo arm. Use a cutoff wheel or some sort of snippers to cut the sharp ends off of the screws that you use to mount it. Now we're going to cut out the control horns for the ailerons. Make note of the shape of the control horns that I'm cutting out here. These are the ones for the ailerons. The tail surface control horns are different than these. Use a very sharp knife to make sure the aileron control horn slot is cleaned out all the way through to the hinge line. Install the control horns using a wet application of welders. We're going to go ahead and slide them into the slot, make sure that they are flush on the top and that they do not extend too far into the hinge line, and clean up the excess glue. It's important to make sure that these control horns are in flush and that they have the same geometry side to side. It's important with the ailerons to make sure you have the same throw on the right side as you do on the left side, so you want to make sure here that they look the same from side to side. We're going to begin building the aileron push rods. First thing we're going to do is take a sander and scuff up all four ends of our aileron push rods. And then we're going to take the Z-bends and scuff them up as well. After both ends are scuffed up, we're going to put a Z-bend on one end of the carbon rods and glue it into position. It's important with the technique on this airplane, since we're using Z-bends on both sides, that you make sure you only glue one Z-bend on one side of the push rod to start with. Here I'm using thin CA, glue on the Z-bend, and then we're going to put on the heat shrink, put on more glue, shrink the heat shrink, and then kick it one last time, and that will finish one end of the push rod. So for the two aileron push rods, I've glued a Z-bend on one end. Now for the other end of each push rod, we're going to put on a Z-bend but not glue it. So you want to start by putting the heat shrink on, and then we're going to take the Z-bend and slide it into the heat shrink while it's loose. The key here is to make sure it's far enough away from the end of the push rod so that the heat shrink won't shrink down over the end of the push rod. We're going to shrink the heat shrink up, and then we're going to let it cool off. As the heat shrink gets cool, you'll actually create a nice slidable Z-bend that will allow us to make the adjustment on the airplane. It's very, very important to make sure that you get these Z-bends on before you put them on the airplane. You never want to apply any sort of heat or flame near EPP because you will melt or deform the EPP. If you've got your adjustable Z-bend in place, go ahead and install it on the aileron control horn, and then we'll finish up the other push rod before we finish up the linkage. Notice how the aileron servo arm needs to arc forward towards the front of the plane for proper geometry. We're going to take the servo arm off and put the Z-bends on. Remember, because we have Z-bends on the other side, we have to take the servo arm off so that we can rotate it around these Z-bends. After you get both Z-bends in, go ahead and put the servo arm back on the servo, and we'll adjust the length of the push rods. So go ahead and center the aileron servo arm, either mechanically or electronically. At this point, it doesn't matter. Then we'll go ahead and pull the Z-bends to the right length so that the ailerons are straight. Just check the trailing edge of the aileron against the side of the fuselage to make sure everything is straight. Once you're happy with the length of the push rod, use some fresh CA and a clean glue tip. Put one little drop of CA right at the opening of the heat shrink at the end and let gravity pull the CA through the heat shrink Z-bend joint. You'll know that you've got enough CA in it when you can see a little drop of CA come out the other side of the heat shrink. Then kick it and set it aside and let it completely dry. So we're going to go ahead and install the rudder servo. It goes in this hole here in the vertical orientation with the output gear going forward. Again, we're going to use a little bit of welders right in the tab area and on the sides and bottoms of the servo. It's important that you don't put too much glue in when you're gluing in the servo, because you may have to cut out one of these servos in the future. So don't put glue someplace that you're not going to be able to reach with a sharp knife to cut out the servo later on. We're going to go ahead and mount the elevator servo similarly to how we've mounted the other servos. The one thing you can do here to make your radio install a little bit neater is because the elevator servo lead is so far away from the center of the airplane, you can kind of bury the lead in the foam a little bit to get it back to the center. That'll make it easier to tighten up and hide the wires later on. After you've got the servos in, let's go ahead and use the edge of the bench or the edge of a table to kind of get the airplane laying flat again. It's important because EPP is flexible that you make sure everything is straight and flush in this position. We're going to get ready to install the bottom part of the fuselage. You want to make sure you get glue all the way down the center line and into all of the tab holes. The single most important step in this process is to make sure that the front of the airplane is flush. All four pieces of the fuselage need to come together straight so that the motor mount will sit straight. As always with welders, take some time to clean up any excess glue that might have come out of the joint. While this joint dries, make sure you take some time to make sure that it is square with the wings. It's a little bit difficult sometimes with EPP to make things square because everything is so flexible. But trust your eye, and you can also use the laser cut parts board as a right angle device. Now that we've got the major construction parts of the fuselage done, we're going to go ahead and get some welders on everything and let it start tacking up. We're going to get the rudder assembled here. One thing there is you want to make sure you're not putting any welders on the little arced part that goes around the elevator joiner. We're going to cut out the little tail skid off of the wheel pants, get some welders on that and let it start to tack up. It tacks onto the bottom of the rudder piece forward of the hinge line. Remove the motor mount from the laser cut parts sheet. We'll get some welders on that too and let it start to tack up. going to get some welders on the fuselage and let that start tacking up too. It's also a good idea to use a little bit of welders to create a small fillet of glue right around the center joint where all four pieces come together. After we've tacked up for a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and install all the parts. Just like we did before, you kind of want to roll each piece into position to make sure everything is lined up. And again, because it's not been tacking up for too long, you can still make adjustments on things as you go. It's fairly critical when installing the motor mount to make sure everything is square. You want each of the little tabs to line up perfectly with each of the fuselage tabs, and the center of the mount to be going down exactly the center line of the airplane. Now that we've got the basic parts of the airframe put together, it's a good idea to kind of go over everything, make sure everything is straight and square and that you didn't miss any joints with glue. One of the most common places to miss joints is right around the servos. I know when you're putting the fuselage together, sometimes you'll go a little bit light on the glue around the servos, so it'll be easier to get them in. That was a good time just to go back and make sure that you got solid joints around there, because that's the most important place where you don't want to have any flexing. Next step for us is going to be to build a landing gear. Unlike some of our larger airplanes, the Mini does not have any trussing on the bottom. So the landing gear are actually an integral part of the fuselage for structural reasons. They're nice to have, just to have something to set the airplane on when you're not flying it, but they are also structural, so I would not omit them. We're going to get the two long flat carbon rods out of the kit, and we're also going to cut out this square piece of plywood and the two round pieces of plywood with slots in them. This will also be a good time to get the EPP wheel pans ready to install. To begin installing the landing gear, we want to fill up the slots in the fuselage for the landing gear legs with welders. There's two smaller slots on the horizontal fuselage on each side of the center line, and then there's one in the center on the bottom of the fuselage. The large one on the bottom of the fuselage is where we're going to put the little plywood square. That's going to be our landing gear plate where the gear legs will come through and create an X. You're going to pass one of the legs in front of the plywood plate and one of the legs behind the plywood plate to make an X right in the center. Now I have found using welders that you do not need to use any thread to tie the gear legs together in the center. If you were building this airplane with CA, I would use a needle and thread to wrap the X in the center and then hit it with thin CA. Because the gear legs are a wet application, we've got a while to wait while those dry. Because we have one wing hang off the bench, one of the things we can do is install one set of the side force generators. So go ahead and cut them out. We split them in half on the rear, and then we're going to go ahead and put welders on the wing and the tabs and install them. Another thing we can do while the glue dries on the landing gear is to prepare the tail push rods. Just like we did with ailerons, we're going to scuff up the ends of the push rods scuff up the Z-bends, and glue on a Z-bend on the end of each rod. The thing that's different though about these push rods is that there are 10 push rod guides that go down the tail of the aircraft that holds these push rods in position. So we need to get the plywood laser cut sheet and cut out these 10 little push rod guides. Then we're going to put 5 of them each on each push rod before we put on the second Z-bend. So now that we have 5 push rod guides on each push rod, we're going to go ahead and put the heat shrink and Z-bend on the push rod and leave them adjustable just like we did with the ailerons. Another thing we can do while we're waiting for glue to dry is to put on these little plywood circles. These little plywood circles kind of do 2 things. One is they create a hard point that will actually slide on a gym floor or something smooth and work as a wheel. And they also give us a flat surface to mount the wheel pants to. I use thin CA and kicker to attach these little discs. Welders on one side of the wheel pants and on the little plywood circles on the landing gear and set them aside to dry. So the landing gear legs have been drying for about 20 minutes and the gear pants themselves have tacked up for about 10 minutes. What I want to do is put on one of the gear pants and then make sure that it's level with the ground when the airplane is sitting on the gear, and then we can take the other gear pant and put it on and make sure that it's level. Now we can install the other set of the side force generators. Now we can get ready to install the tail push rods. There are control horns for the rudder and the elevator, but they're different. The elevator is the shorter control horn and the rudder is the longer. So just like we did with the ailerons, we will cut out each of the control horns from the sheet, and then we'll use a sharp knife to clean out the slot for the control horns in each of the control surfaces. It's important, because of the way the Z-bend function on this airplane, not to glue into control horns just yet. Another thing to point out is the little circles that are left in the plywood sheet are not used on the aircraft. Begin the install of the push rods. We're going to use one of the servo arms out of the servo hardware kit. That's the single-sided arm that's the longest. We're going to put it on the Z-bend and then put it on the servo and mechanically move the servo arm to be 90 degrees to the servo output. Then we're going to put the control horn on the Z-bend before we put it on the aircraft. Because remember, we're not using quick links here. We have to make sure that we put the control horns in after we've put them on the Z-bend. After you have rough fit the push rod length, go ahead and glue in the control horn. Make sure you keep it on the Z-bend as you glue it in. Complete the same scenario on the rudder push rod. While the tail control horns dry, it's a good time to bind up your receiver, center your aileron servo, and set your aileron end points. After your servo's centered, don't forget to put in the servo arm screw. Just move the EPP out of the way so that you can put the screw in with a small screwdriver. After the tail control horns have dried, we're going to want to find the little holes in the sides of the fuselage that the pushrod guides go into. Once you find the hole, you can push the pushrod guide into it and it'll kind of pop into position. However, you want to make sure that the pushrod guides aren't so close to the foam that if you glued them, it would actually glue the pushrod to the foam, but you want them far enough in the holes that they will actually glue to something. So my preferred glue for doing this is Thin CA. There is a downside with Thin CA though, is it will wick into the wood up into the holes where the push rods actually go through. So by doing this, I know for a fact that I'm going to get some glue onto those push rods. But after they've glued in, you can go back and clean up any extra glue that you have and make sure that your push rod runs freely without any trouble. It's absolutely important to make sure that there's no drops of glue or anything that prevents those push rods from moving absolutely smoothly through the guides. Pushrod guides are glued in. You can adjust the length of the pushrod, glue on the final Z-bend, and snip off any excess pushrod that you have with a pair of snippers. After you've finished the pushrod install, go ahead and electronically set your end points and put in the servo arm screw. Technique for doing these pushrods is to start at the back, put in one pushrod guide, hold it down with your thumb, and then put in the second, and keep doing that as you move forward. The biggest problem is that the pushrod will try to pull the pushrod guides out until all of the pushrods are in position. After you've installed the elevator pushrod, go ahead and install the elevator servo arm screw. Adjust the pushrod to length. Glue in the Z-bend, snip the rod off, and then make sure you've got everything centered and set up for endpoints on the radio before we start the engine install.
This is a very small, very lightweight model. It's made of very thin material. And even though it looks flexible on the ground while you're working on it and moving the servos around in the air, it's absolutely a very stiff and precise airplane. To install the motor speed control combo, there are little white spacers that come in the motor kit. Each of those spacers is used to space the speed control away from the plywood motor mount so that the speed control can breathe behind the motor. Inside the motor hardware pack, you'll find a wire that plugs into this connector on the speed control. That is the wire that goes back and plugs into the throttle channel on your receiver. Go ahead and run your receiver back to the location that you want to mount it. I like to mount it right there, right underneath the elevator servo. I'm going to use welder's adhesive to glue it into place. So I'll just put a little dab of welders on the airplane, rub the receiver around on it, and then set it aside to kind of tack up. While that receiver's tacking up is a good time to figure out where exactly to put your battery and mark your CG location. This airplane is about halfway between the spar and the elevator servo is the balance point. It's 61 millimeters from the leading edge of the wing. After I've got all the wires pulled tight through a small zip tie, I'll glue the little zip tie down into the corner joint of the aircraft there to kind of hold the wires out of place. To put the prop on, we're going to use the black O-rings that come in the kit. First thing you want to do is stretch the O-ring out a little bit. I usually stretch it out just by putting it on my finger. We're using a GWS 735 prop. The O-ring goes on to one of the little set screws in the prop saver on the front of the motor. So hook the O-ring around on one of those set screws. We'll go ahead and put the prop on the motor. The motor will actually hold the prop into position all by itself. And then we're going to scoop up the O-ring with the tip of our finger and stretch it over the prop and kind of use our finger to shovel it onto the last little set screw. Best technique about that is to just get something underneath it like your finger or even a screwdriver and hook it around over that O-ring. So now that we have the prop on and the receiver glued down, we can figure out where we're going to put our battery hole. Pick the airplane up by the CG mark that you put on earlier and start sliding the battery around to find the right location. Obviously that's a little bit nose heavy and that's a little bit tail heavy. What I found with this airplane is the battery likes to be right on the spar for a perfect CG. With a really light battery, this is a 150 milliamp battery, I find that you're probably going to want to have the battery in front of the aileron servo. So once you've figured out where you want to put the battery, go ahead and mark the battery hole location. I like to put my battery in this plane crossways, just like this. So I'm going to trace around the outside of the battery. We're going to get a sharp blade, and we're going to cut the hole just smaller than the marks that I made. After you've cut the hole and you've test flown it and you're happy with the battery location, it's a good idea to go back and put welders around the inside of this hole. That'll give it a nice rubbery grip on the battery. It'll keep the battery from sliding around. So if you've never used this motor before, one thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that when you plug in a fresh battery and you go to power up on the throttle stick, the first time you move the throttle stick forward, you won't have any power. You've got to bring it forward and then bring it back to idle, and that'll arm it and you'll have power. So like right here on the maiden flight in my workshop, you've got to bring the power up, bring the power back to idle, And then when you bring the power up again, you'll have power to fly the airplane. This completes the end of the build video. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. I hope you love your Mini as much as I do. See you at the flying field.